So we'll talk about give you some vocabulary here now, so we can start getting up to speed. Most people have probably heard of sag, measure and sag. What we're talking about when we talk about sag is we're talking about the motorcycle chassis settling, either by itself or with a rider on it. And we'll talk about measuring and adjusting it shortly, but when we talk about sag, we're talking about the distance the bike settles from a fully extended, and see how this bike settles some all by itself, and then if I got on the bike, sat on it, it would sag further. These distances are important to know because they tell us important information about our spring rates and the initial setup on the motorcycle. So sag being an initial term. Preload. Preload is relevant to a spring. A lot of people confuse preload and spring rate. Now, classically in the old days when you had your street bike that was all soft and mushy, the guy would pull his fork caps off and cram a big old spacer in there on top of the stock spacer, and now his fork was stiffer. Now what you've done is add preload, and preload is just extra compression added to the free length of the spring. So when this thing's installed in the fork, this happens to be a shock spring, we're going to have initial pressure on it even when there's no weight on the bike at all, right? That's preload on the spring. Distance it's compressed from its free length laying on a table. Now, where people get confused, you can make the damping unit, fork or shock, feel stiffer by adding preload. But what you're doing is making it feel stiffer on top. If this is our range of travel of 5 inches, we're making it stiffer in the first inch, right? We're not changing the spring's rate. It's got a physical characteristic. We can't change that. This spring has characteristics called spring rate. And what we're talking about is the amount of pressure this spring will exert for a given unit of compression. And simplest example is a shock spring. Don't ask me why, but in America, certain things are in SAE units, some things are in metric. In America, we talk about shock springs in SAE still. Springs are expressed in pounds per inch of pressure. So if you have guys, you hear about a 400 or 500 or 600, whatever you got. If you've got a 400 pound per inch spring, that means if you take it from its free length when it has 0 pressure and you compress it 1 inch and you had a scale, it would have 400 pounds of force on it. Now, when you hear about straight rate and progressive springs, okay, straight rate means that spring is going to exert the same amount of pressure for a given unit, right? So 1 inch equals 400 pounds of pressure, 2 inches equals 800 pounds of pressure, 3 inches equals 1,200 pounds of pressure, right? This is a simple analogy or a drawing of a straight rate spring. Progressive springs gain rate as you compress them. So this same spring might look like this. You would 400 in the first inch, 500 in the second inch, added together is 9, right? Maybe it has 600 in the third inch. Now it's got 1,500 pounds of pressure. This is a simple demonstration of progressive spring rate, all right? Currently, as of this date of this taping, no suspension tuners I know of in America recommend progressively wound springs. Traxxion Dynamics, our company, or any of our competitors, pretty much everyone using springs for aggressive sport riding or track use or race use runs a straight rate spring, okay? Dampening. Dampening is the basic function of your suspension. Springs are there to support the weight of the bike and allow it to roll over bumps, but what we're trying to do is control the movement of the springs, and that's where dampening comes in. That's what the cartridge inside your fork does. And the cartridge is much like a long skinny shock absorber. This is kind of what's contained inside your fork. It kind of does a little basic moving like that, just like a shock absorber. And obviously on the back of your motorcycle, you'll have a single shock, for the most part. Unless you have a more of a street fighter style bike like a ZRX 1100 or 1200 or something like that, which is a popular track days bike as well. For the most part, we'll find single shocks on bikes these days.